Hey guys, I'm Zac.
I'm Gavin.
Welcome to the third episode of the Vanguard Podcast. This week we had a great chat with two Washington State congressional candidates who are bucking Democratic orthodoxy and trying to get elected on an anti-corporate populist message.
First, we're talking to Chris Armitage, an Air Force veteran and comedian who's trying to get elected in the 5th District of Washington State. And then Rebecca Parson, who's an activist who's running in the 6th Congressional District.
Hope you enjoyed the conversation.
My name is Christopher Armitage. I'm running for the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington's 5th Congressional District. If elected, I'll be the youngest sitting member of the House of Representatives. I'm 28 years old. I did 7 years in the Air Force, deployed to the Middle East twice on non-combat deployments as security forces and a base defense operations controller. I did presidential security for Barack Obama during his trip to Argentina, where I led a small security team that worked with transnational forces to include Argentinian special forces. I have a Master's of Science in Homeland Security that I earned while active duty Air Force as a staff sergeant. I left the Air Force to pursue stand-up comedy full-time. I'd always been doing it as a hobby, and I decided I wanted to just be done with 911 calls and domestic violence calls and even, the Homeland Security stuff. I just wanted to tell jokes for a living. But I stepped into this race over a year ago because I don't trust that we're going to get – I'm going to have someone to vote for who is ready to fight for what we really need, who isn't going to use our futures as a bargaining chip. Something like healthcare isn't supposed to be a political bargaining chip. We have people dying every single year. Being at war for almost my entire lifetime is not something that we should be supporting. And these, a lot of conservatives are, it's abortion and guns decide their votes. And you know what? That makes them a cohesive voting bloc. We need people who are like that for healthcare. And there's crossover too. I've met people. I've been to 25 towns across this congressional district. The district is 25% bigger than New Jersey, 25% bigger than that whole state. I've been to 25 towns here, and I've met people who say, don't take my guns. I want universal health care, though. And that, those conversations are what break down those barriers where we stop seeing other people as Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or Green Party first. We start seeing them as Americans first, as members of our community first. And that's my political philosophy.
And it's such a missed opportunity on the Democratic side, at least, because, there is this huge population of working people across the country that would absolutely vote for any ticket that would guarantee them health care, just because people are hurting. People need universal health care. And the fact that the Democrats aren't leading the charge on that and, are kind of putting forward this diluted message, people understand when they say expanded access to health care. They know that doesn't mean their lives are going to improve in a serious way or that they're actually going to get affordable health care. So, I love that you're bringing that to the table. And, it's not just a bargaining chip. It's a serious platform that the left needs to embrace if they're serious about courting the rural vote and the working class vote.
Centrism is a myth. It's not a real thing. Your feelings about guns don't have anything to do with your feelings on taxes, don't have anything to do with your feelings on war, don't have anything to do with your feelings on healthcare. There isn't. And that's what I realized over the last few years, doing comedy in a lot of different communities, being in the military and serving side by side with people who come from very diverse backgrounds. People will say, this is everything Republicans feel. How, why do they all line up? And it's like, do you just feel the opposite of them on everything? What makes you any different? Think for yourself on every single issue. I think I'm a lot better on guns than my opponent because my opponent doesn't actually have sincerely held beliefs on guns. I've carried guns. I have a concealed carry permit. And to me, that's one issue. They call me left. I want universal single-payer health care. I want universal mental health care. I want a living wage. I want climate action. I'm also not interested in going after people's guns, particularly marginalized and impacted communities, which I think right now more people than ever are realizing that they arming themselves, taking their security into their own hands is something they feel like they need to do because they don't trust the police to be able to do that. And
we wanted to talk to you about that. Obviously, you've been really molded by your career in law enforcement and in the armed forces. So you were a first responder as well as a member of the Air Force. And As a veteran, what is your reaction to the use of militarized forces upon the protesters that are kind of popping up all across the cities in the wake of the murder of George Floyd?
Well, it's the way law enforcement's behaving is a tremendous infringement on our constitutional rights. And I wish people fought for every other constitutional amendment as hard as they fight for the Second Amendment. Because the fact is, when you kill someone as a law enforcement officer, particularly someone who doesn't have a gun, doesn't have a knife, they're not coming at you, whatever, you have, even if they are doing those things, you have become their judge, jury, and executioner. We are guaranteed, it's codified in our founding documents, you're supposed to be able to have a trial by your peers. You're supposed to have your day in court no matter what you're accused of, innocent until proven guilty. You're supposed to have a right to privacy. When our founders said that they wanted to protect people, when they wrote it in our founding document, that you have a right to protection from unwarranted searches and seizures. Think about the terminology, unwarranted. They need a reason, not just a physical document called a warrant, a warranted reason. They need a reason to invade your privacy, your space, your business, your property. And so to me, decriminalizing sex work, decriminalizing drugs, making sure that we respect people's individual rights. I find people all over the political spectrum who agree with these things. And so clearly the political dichotomy as it exists is completely useless when it comes to being on the ground with the people.
Yeah. And that's especially pertinent in your district, which is a pretty red district from what I'm aware. Since 2005, a Republican, Cathy Mcmorris Rodgers, has occupied the seat you're running for. Can you tell us anything about your opponent and what else you would bring to the community that she's not?
Yeah, well, Cathy has been in elected political offices since I was 2 years old. Before that, she worked for a politician, and her father was a chair of a local Republican Party group for a county Republican group. She was raised for this. She believes in criminalizing abortion. She doesn't think a person has jurisdiction over their bodies. That's the way I view it. And so, she wants to overturn Roe v. Wade. We got to bring this fight on every front. And speaking to the progressive community, and I'm not really a big fan of the label anymore, just because I've realized that we're there's so much more to the political spectrum, and labeling ourselves limits us so much. But they're useful. Labels also have uses, and I'm not putting them down. It's just a personal choice I've made. But speaking to the progressive community, we have so much ground that people can make with similar overlapping issues that we care about. I've got support from the Washington State Progressive Party and from the Washington State Libertarian Party, because there are policies that you're only going to get in those lanes because they're non-authoritarian. As long as the Democratic Party refuses to invest in rural communities, blue-collar communities, they're not going to grow. It's just not going to happen. You got to speak to people. You got to keep fighting on every front. I think of it in the military sense pretty often. That's just framing I use. But when this seat was held by a Democrat from 1964 to 1994, he was a Speaker of the House. And he lost his seat in the 1994 Republican wave election. He lost it because Republicans fought every single seat. It's like Speaker Pelosi, a little bit different since they're, a deeper blue, but you don't make you Speaker of the House unless they think your district is safe for that party. You got to fight every front. And also it's about shining a light on cockroaches. It's shining a light on despicable behavior that kills people. We have the moral high ground. Let's own it.
Have you received any kind of help from the Democratic Party, the DCCC? Have they invested any resources into your race?
No. Locally, the county Democrats have been great. We have endorsements from the Spokane County Democrats, the Walla Walla County Democrats, the Pend Oreille County Democrats, 4th and 6th Legislative District Democrats. They're great. I love them on the ground. Nothing from above. I'm an independent voice. I'm open to sitting at the table with anybody. But also we just haven't raised enough money for them to pay attention to us. We've raised about $100,000. If we raise $100,000 to $200,000 this month, they might come around. And that's the inside scoop, by the way. That's how it works. There's a lot of organizations, they purely determine candidates' viability by fundraising. And it's hard to decide other metrics. So, what else do you got to go on? And we're getting there with our fundraising. We're moving in that direction. But I think it ignores strong candidates because there's more to it than money. I think the Democratic Party picks their candidates generally based on who paid their dues, and the Republican Party picks their candidates based off of who's good at earning votes. And that's the game we're playing here. If we don't win, people die. That's what our policies That's what our policies mean. So we got to win elections. What's going to give us the best strategic advantage?
Yeah, just to kind of expel on that, one of the kind of prevailing narratives that you'll hear is how polarized we are in this country, how the Republicans and Democrats don't have anything in common, which just seems pretty untrue, right? If you kind of break out of that spell, you talk to people, I think of my dad who's voted Republican probably his whole life, right? But, he's outraged about the police brutality right now, that he could be sold on the case for Medicare for all, right? But he, like you said, he wants to, keep his gun, with him. So I wonder, what bridges would you build if you were to arrive at Congress, and how would you kind of break up this idea that if you're not purely with us, you're purely against us?
Campaign finance reforms to start, because I think that's when you can really start having good faith, substantive disagreements versus disagreements that are fueled by who's lining your pockets. That's a pretty big part of it. Who knows if the day will, I will work with anybody who is, the things we're working on together benefit the American public. Getting things passed that are going to benefit Eastern Washington and America and the world. I think, the Republican Party, as soon as Barack Obama was elected, Mitch McConnell said they were going to do everything they could to make him a first-term president. Even when Donald Trump was elected, there was still talk about, let's see what we can do to work with him. I don't know if I'm going to be able to heal. I'm not going to make promises that are unrealistic to make. I'm going to go there. I'm going to sit down at the table with people. I think, just being able to make people feel heard and respected goes a long way. And then shaming people. I am probably going to shame members of Congress who just sell out the American public. If you're a hack, a corrupt hack, I'll call you that to your face, because that's what we need as a nation. That's what.
Good, yeah.
I'm an Eagle Scout, and whether it was the Boy Scouts or when it was, serving, or even in comedy, you got to call out BS when you see it, or the whole team goes down. That's it. We lose when we can't figure out a way to work together, but that doesn't mean you follow through with a bad plan. That means you have the hard conversations, you call people out, and you're not afraid of looking mean.
Yeah, that's so essential right now, especially as, both parties' leaderships have totally dropped the ball when it comes to the handling of the coronavirus. And now that we're seeing both party leaderships have a totally kind of underwhelming milquetoast response to what's going on with the president's actions regarding the protests right now. It seems like both players on both teams are afraid to call out their own team. And what you're talking about is, I think, really essential to building a stronger left movement in this country, and that, holding our own accountable, calling out corruption where we see it. And I think that in and of itself is a kind of what you would be bringing to Congress, as opposed to your opponent, who clearly is not holding the members of her team accountable in this dire moment.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what people are seeing. And that doesn't mean there aren't degrees. I think more Democrats were critical of President Obama during his time than Republicans, if you did the math on it. And gosh, it's so frustrating to see people. My opponent is objectively more authoritarian than probably any Democrat. But people get a lot more caught up in the Dem versus Dem races without realizing, and it's not about Republican and Democrat. Justin Amash, I donated to Justin Amash, Representative Amash, after he was willing to stand up and speak his voice. He was one of the founders of the Liberty Caucus, but I think he really believes what he's saying, and that's someone you can work with. And so it's bigger than party, but look at people where people actually are on the issues, and get involved. My opponent Takes 5 million a cycle. 5 million every cycle. It's not coming from in this district. The last census had our district at 10% unemployment. The last census had our district at 1/3 of the people under the poverty line. My opponent gets 5 million every 2 years from corporations that can trust them to be a rubber stamp. So we got to do what we can, whether it's volunteering, whether it's donating, whether it's just talking about it with other people on social media to fight back.
Totally.
Yeah, in one of your campaign ads, you spoke about the benefits you received as a veteran, like paid education and healthcare. What can you say in favor of a robust social safety net, and why you believe all Americans are deserving of it?
That's one of my core beliefs. I saw it in the military is we had universal single payer healthcare. That's what the military has. It's millions of service members and their families have on-base clinics and hospitals where there is no billing. The doctors don't make more if they see more patients. You're not cycled in as quick as you can so they can make enough money. And I'm not calling it the doctor's greed. They have a lot of overhead too. But in the military, they weren't writing explanations to send to an insurance company for the insurance company to decide if the doctor is correct in their assessment that something is needed. They just, if you need an x-ray, they just say, go to the 3rd floor, get an x-ray. So I've seen universal single payer in America work for millions of Americans. There's no reason we should be the only first world country where children die from insulin rationing. There's no reason that people have to raise money because their father needs a kidney transplant. That's not the standard. We're the only ones who have this problem in all of the developed nations on earth, and even some less developed nations. Now, living wage, that's just being pro-family. I don't want parents working 4 jobs and not being able to spend time with their kids. They're raising the next generation. I want to make sure people are able to have quality education, quality family time. I think that's important for development and also personal time. I want an America where everyone's able to have a savings account. If you have a job, you're working full time, you should be able to take care of yourself no matter what you're doing. And so the military community benefited from these things. And beyond just universal public university tuition, by the way, or tuition-free public universities, I also want to see tuition-free tradesman programs. I really want to see, if you want to enter a trade, you can go get the education for free from a union. Once you graduate, you can get a little bonus, and that's what the military did. And I think as a society, the average tradesman in this country is 58 years old. Why are we investing in our future as a country? Hopefully that answers it. I'm soapboxing pretty hard here. I'm amped. I've been doing phone calls all day. So
you talk about universal programs and stuff a lot, and something you propose on your website is a green jobs guarantee. Would you also support like an expanded Social Security program or a universal basic income, something to get that money into people's wallets that need it?
Yes, I'm proud to support expanded Social Security or a UBI. I think it's a really exciting possibility because one of the greatest conservative complaints is if you just give people money, they're not going to want to work. If some people make less money working a job and sending their kids to daycare than they do if they're just on unemployment. That's not a problem of unemployment. I don't think it's my place to say who should and shouldn't have food,
right?
Particularly when children are involved.
Yeah.
I think that's legislating morality to try and say, we got to figure out how to make people work, so they better just work or starve. No, congrats on being an American. You don't have to starve. You get a roof over your head.
Yeah, you could almost call it like state-sponsored violence if you think about it, that the fact that the money exists, our taxpayer money exists for a program like that, yet thousands of families are literally starving or, failing to pay their bills because they don't have enough money. And the fact that it is allowed to go on is outrageous.
Yeah. Well, that's why I support UBI, because I think it's a great way if people – it's not means tested. I think means testing degrades the effectiveness of a lot of really well-intentioned programs. Some of these programs, 2/3 of their costs are administrative because they want to give you a $1,000 drug test to get $250 worth of services or aid. And it's pragmatism. It's just doing the math. Oh, I did the Yang thing, Matt. By the way, I'm not getting involved in the presidential race. I've done everything I can to avoid it. All politics is local, and that's my mindset.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Talking about expanding social safety nets, the cost is always raised, right? Somehow modern monetary theory is only ever applied when it's Wall Street. And for as long as I can remember, and I'm sure the same is true for Gavin, we've always been at war in this country. My earliest memory of politics is not, when the Twin Towers fell, but when I remember seeing Saddam Hussein hung for his what ultimately believed very, very little, if no, involvement in 9/11. And since then, we've been at war in Iraq, Afghanistan. We've had shadow wars in Africa, all throughout the Middle East. And that has cost this country trillions of taxpayer dollars. We haven't seen any return on it. And I think, how are we going to rein that in, protect our troops, and stop pumping tax dollars to the war profiteers so that we can reinvest it in our own communities using the proposals that you've kind of outlined?
Well, part of it comes back to campaign finance reform. You want to talk war. I think we need to, this is a stance I haven't heard any other candidates willing to take. But we need to comply with the international criminal courts. Right now, the international criminal courts almost exclusively try people from the continent of Africa for war crimes because other nations don't want to comply. If the United States isn't an ethical and moral leader, then we're tyrannical. And so a president shouldn't feel insulated, or a member of Congress shouldn't feel insulated from the far more wide-reaching effects of the decisions they make. If you approve torture, I don't just want to see some staff sergeant or some private first class getting penalized for it. You got to go up to the top. You got to hold people accountable. If you couldn't make it through the Nuremberg trial standards, then you don't deserve to continue to stay free or to lead a country.
To add to that, I suppose, Noam Chomsky famously said that every U.S. president would be indicted for war crimes if the Nuremberg standard was put into place. Now, as we, as you say that, how will we, oversee our presidents who have, routinely neglected to prosecute their predecessors so that they themselves continue the precedent of not being prosecuted? You'll see that Obama, he didn't prosecute any of the George Bush administration for their blatant war crimes that were committed throughout the number of black sites. There's a question as to whether or not Barack Obama's airstrikes were justified or considered war crimes, especially some of the shadow involvement. How and I don't even want to get into Donald Trump, but how do we regulate that? How do we oversee that when our executive branch is seemingly so corrupt and blazing in public? We know they've committed these crimes, these atrocities, but we seemingly are without any option to take action. Trump was impeached for business dealings with Ukraine, not because he overrode weapons, a vote against Congress and sent weapons to commit genocide in Yemen.
We've got to demand better. And it's not just electoral politics. I mean, I'm stepping up because I think most working class people are a better fit for representing their communities than most of the people who currently represent our communities, and are really just there because they're better fundraisers, more well-connected, they come from money or power. We have to demand better. We have to be asking these questions at public forums, getting involved in politics. Fact is, the NRA doesn't have a ton of members, but every time they send out a donation ask email from their people, folks just throw money at it because their voters are coordinated. Their support is deep. We need deep, reliable support for justice and morality and ethics. And how do we build it? We build a movement. You talk to enough people. I think at least a few people have gotten on board for this stuff and gotten to share interesting ideas, and we're doing that right now. So, and then other than that, take to the streets, demonstrate, make your voices heard that way. That's how we do it, though. It's not going to be easy. It's not a simple answer. It's a war in its own way. It's a war in the minds of Americans and in the ballot boxes and at every single office, up and down ballot.
Yeah, and when it comes to like kind of the you could say the deep state, the establishment is kind of infringing on these rights. we're also seeing a lot of rise on censorship on social medias, Twitter, YouTube, and not to mention, of course, the nationwide crackdown on protesters that's going on right now in the streets of America. If you were elected to Congress, what kind of legislation would you support or propose to protect the First Amendment, ensure that our free speech and right to protest is protected at all costs?
Well, one of my favorite things to say lately is the First Amendment doesn't have a bedtime. I think censorship on social media is important, but there's a more nuanced form of propaganda that's much more insidious. Censorship used to be the only thing to worry about with authoritarian governments, and now we have to worry about they don't just shoot the person who puts out the story they don't like and erase the story. No, they release 9 other news stories, all with some degree of truth, and people just don't know what to believe. There's astroturfing and just putting out more false information to confuse everyone. We're in a tough position here. But you know what? You don't fight for what's right because you know you're going to win. You fight for what's right for you, for your family, for your loved ones, for your community, for your nation, for humanity, for the planet, for the future. And so it's about speaking truth to power. And don't let the corrupt forces take control of the narrative. They're trying to take away our rights. Shout it from the rooftops.
On a legislative term, would you vote to reauthorize the Patriot Act if that were to come up to vote while you were in Congress? No.
End the Patriot Act. Audit the Fed, too, while you're at it. But, the Patriot Act's massive infringement on our First, Second.
I think that's a great place to kind of wrap up. We want to be respectful of your time. Can you tell people where they can go to support you? So maybe we can get a little bit more attention from the DCC.
I don't know if I guess I shouldn't turn down support if they want to help out. But you can check out armitageforcongress.com, ARMITAGEFOR Congress.com.
Awesome.
And again, thank you so much for having me on.
We loved having you. Thanks so much for coming on to chat with us.
Yeah, and once we're in our van, we'll be in Washington at some point. So if you're around, we'd love to talk to you again in the van or, social distancing.
In the van. No, in the van.
All right. Yeah. We'll see you then. Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Take it easy, gents.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. We're really excited to speak with you. I think an important place to start in light of the kind of nation's response to the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent lack of action that was taken by local authorities before the protests began, and quite frankly, the aggressive response from the police as a result of the peaceful protests. We've seen a lot of abdication from current congressional representatives, pointing at the fact that this is a local issue that needs to be addressed at a local level. But seeing as how this has erupted in so many cities across our country, is there action that can be taken at a federal level to kind of rein in our police, which to most people seem almost out of control?
Yeah, I think you're right that it's, it's a local issue, but if you're a federal representative, what you do affects the entire country, and you serve your constituents in your district, but what the decisions you make don't only affect your district, they affect the entire country. And we're also seeing people make the argument, it's just a few bad apples in the police departments. Well, then why did a police officer yesterday put his knee on a protester's throat while that protester, holding the protester to the ground and put his knee on the throat? And that protester was protesting that a police officer in Minneapolis did that to somebody on Monday. And then we have, yesterday in New York, as of the time that we're recording this, yesterday in New York, two police SUVs ran over protesters. They were at a total stop, and then they just put the pedal to the metal and started running them over.
And just hate crime in Charleston a few years ago. If you recall, the man who drove his car into the crowd of protesters, except this time it came from the police.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it has yet to be confirmed, but there's a video that's gotten a lot of views on Twitter of a police officer flashing a white power sign in New York. And the attorney general of the state responded saying, please report this to my office. We're going to look into it. And so I really, the whole idea that this is just a bad few apples, no, it's a systemic problem. And if you're looking at this and you can't see that it's a systemic problem, I highly doubt that the Minneapolis Police Department and the Seattle Police Department are talking to each other and telling each other to put their knees on people's throats, yet they're doing it. And yes, there are police groups on Facebook, they share memes, they talk to each other, but I don't really think this is coordinated with police departments across the entire country. It's a systemic problem that causes police to do this. And so as a federal response, what we need to do is to drastically defund the amount of federal money that's going to the police, stop sending military equipment to them. These are not these are not soldiers or military officers. They're not trained to deal with it. Something that really blew my mind was yesterday I was reading about tear gas, and it is actually a chemical weapon, and it was developed for the trenches of World War I. And it was developed in the specific way it was to get around international treaties that existed at the time on using chemical warfare. So it's a chemical weapon that was designed for the trenches of World War I, like the horrors of the trenches. To drive people out of the trenches. Like, it was designed to make people just overcome with panic, not know what's happening, just intense pain, and then run out of the trench where they could then be shot. That's what's being used on the streets of our country.
Yeah, that was what was used for me and Gavin both. Yeah, just yesterday when we were out covering the protests. It's being used pretty indiscriminately, regardless of the city you find yourself in. It's quite shocking.
Yeah, and it seems incredibly ironic and crazy that at these police brutality protests, the police are being more brutal than ever. It seems to be a complete disconnect between the citizens and these increasingly militarized police forces, which are occupying our communities. You've talked about demilitarizing the police. Would you go as far as to say defund the police forces? How can we begin rethinking this issue in our country?
One thing we should definitely do is strip away the sources of funding they have that are unjust. For example, cash bail, and also civil asset forfeiture, because the police can seize your assets. Pull you over. They think you look like you're up to something. They seize your car, and they can literally just take this stuff, and they do not have to give it back. You have to go through a great deal of trouble to get it back. And like, these civil asset forfeiture and cash bail predominantly affect poor people and also people of color. And those are two things that we should ban nationwide. That would take away a lot of the funding that police have. And I think we also need to have community control boards providing oversight. They should be made up 100% of community members and not police. And yeah, I think we should drastically defund them, because there are police forces in other countries that are far less militarized than ours, and they do not have the levels of violence that we do. And it's also it's dangerous because both with the police wielding these weapons that are military grade weapons, and they're not trained military, but also in Seattle yesterday, it would happen on the news. On like the video, I just can't believe that it happened on the news, and then I saw it on Twitter. But a police car had been, I don't think this one was burned out, but it had been, windows were smashed and stuff. And somebody got into it and stole 2 AR-15s out of the police car. And on camera, there was a guy just holding an AR-15, kind of deciding, what am I going to do with this? And then a security person for the news station that was recording this ran up to him and seized it from him. And so it's not just a danger to the police, but also why should anybody have AR-15s? Police, or you don't need it for hunting, school shooters. I mean, it's just, we do not need this level of weaponry out in a domestic, on domestic soil.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that with you and give you an opportunity to discuss what kind of gun reform policy you would like to see occurring in this country, not just from a police level, but we also do have a problem with systemic violence, active shooters, situations like that, because it is quite frankly terribly easy to, in most states, acquire a gun that can do massive amounts of damage. While still understanding that, yes, this is a culture, this is a country with a deep culture of hunting and, personal arms use. How do you envision gun control reform in this country?
Yeah, and it's a good question. And my district it includes rural areas and cities and small towns. And the Olympic Peninsula, there is a culture of hunting and fishing, and people eat. A lot of people eat what they hunt and fish, and they should be able to do that. And there's a culture of responsible gun ownership and pride and heritage in this country. And the types of gun laws that I support, gun reform, would not impact the ability of people to continue that. The stuff I support is things like mandatory and universal background checks, including at gun shows, full federal funding to modernize and optimize existing background check systems and make them compatible across all 50 states, so there aren't any people don't fall through the cracks and kind of take advantage of loopholes. Requiring free safety training and continuing education for all licensed firearm owners. There is required training in some places, but you have to pay for it. And so if you're a poor person who hunts to feed your family, that fee might not be accessible for you, but it is for a rich person. So I think that should be free. I think that we should ban the release of the names of mass shooters because those communities of white supremacists and misogynists who in online forums are they glorify the mass shooters, and they big part of the reason they do it is to seek glorification of their own name. So I think that we should ban the release of their names so that they don't have that as a source or a reason to do that. And then I think we also I support Medicare for all, which is, for anybody listening who doesn't know, single payer healthcare, meaning you can go to the doctor or hospital without having to pay co-pays, deductibles, or premiums. As part of that, we need to increase funding for mental health because 60% of gun deaths are suicides. So that's something that we really need to look at.
Yeah, and on Medicare for all and a lot of those proposals there, you're totally funded by small dollar donations, which would make you unaccountable to some of the corporations that traditionally hold funding over the heads of our elected officials in return for the policy agenda that they wish to see fulfilled. Like I said, your campaign is totally funded by small dollar donations, but the same can't be said for your opponent, the incumbent Representative Derek Kilmer, who was a Clinton delegate in 2016 and is kind of a basic establishment Democrat. Aside from campaign finance, what does your candidacy offer to your community that Kilmer's does not?
Yeah, he's ranked by GovTrack, an independent nonprofit, as the 11th most conservative Democrat in the House. And it's just wild to me because this district has been blue for 55 years. So he's very out of touch with the district, what we want and need. And some of the ways we're different is he doesn't support Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, national rent control, free public college and trade school, or canceling medical and student debt. And I do. He also likes to talk about how he fights against Trump's agenda, but he actually votes with Trump a lot. He voted to extend the Patriot Act, voted to give funding to ICE without sufficient protections for migrants. He voted for warrantless surveillance of Americans' internet usage and browsing history. He voted for Trump's war budget. I mean, on and on, he votes like this with Trump, while putting forward this face of him being, a good Democrat who fights Trump. And so it's very hypocritical. And that's a big part of the reason I decided to run is I can't stand hypocrisy in politics. And, the job, politicians, rightly, a lot of people don't like politicians. They're seen as sleazy. I think they've earned the reputation, but the job itself is supposed to be about service, and the House of Representatives is the people's house. You're supposed to serve the people, not corporations, not some rich billionaire in the White House, like the people of your district. So we're different in a lot of ways on that. He just does not support the policies that would really help people with the problems they're facing in our district with housing, addiction, mental health care, lack of good jobs, climate change. There are a lot of tribes in my district who live on the coastline. They're having to leave behind villages that are on the coast and move them farther upland. And they have lived there in those locations since time immemorial. So, imagine having to leave behind an area where your people have lived since before the time of the Roman Empire. That's how long they've been living there. It's a huge loss. So.
That's actually one of the reasons that we were really excited to talk to you is you made it a very central in most of your campaigning that you're unwilling to be bought. But with so many crises occurring simultaneously around our country, from our government's inability to act in the interest of people, whether that's from law enforcement, unequivocally siding with the police, or pumping trillions of dollars into Wall Street while millions of Americans are uninsured and unemployed in the time of a pandemic, what would you tell voters who believe that the system can't be saved by working within the system, that both sides of the aisle are corrupt and they've seen it, throughout their lives? What would you tell them to get them out to the polls one more time?
I think a lot can be done. For example, if you look at AOC, even Nancy Pelosi says, "Oh, the squad, they're only 4 votes. That's all the power they have." Well, that may be true in a strict sense in the House. Each of them has 1 vote. They're only 4 people. But if it were not for AOC and the Sunrise Movement, literally nobody would be talking about the Green New Deal. The Sunrise Movement and the youth climate movement, are the drivers. And then AOC came to that protest outside Nancy Pelosi's office and just kind of it rocketed to national attention, and everybody was talking about it. And it's supported by a majority of Democratic voters, so is Medicare for All. So, for example, Bernie Sanders, I'm still really disappointed that he didn't win. But because of him, everybody's talking about Medicare for All, and the majority of all voters, not just Democrats, support that. So that's one really big thing. Like, let's say that 20 progressives get into the House this year. That's out of 435. You might think, well, that's not very much. What can they do? But a small group of people inside can do a lot, both like raising awareness of issues like the Squad and AOC have done, but then also like the Freedom Caucus in the House, which started around 2010. They had a huge influence on the direction of American politics. And that was, I think, that caucus started with only 10 people. And I mean, they're a big reason that the Republican Party has gone off the deep end and so far right. So a small number of people can have impact. And then also, there's electoral politics, is not the only way you make change. It's the way that I'm working on, but people work in labor, union organizing, tenant organizing, protesting out on the streets about police brutality towards Black people. There's lots of different ways. Electoral is just one, but it is one way that can have a lot of influence.
You spoke about the Freedom Caucus, and that brings to mind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's plan to put together a progressive caucus, which would kind of try to emulate a similar strategy that was so effective on the right wing. She ultimately abandoned that plan, seemingly in the wake of the implosion of Senator Sanders' campaign. But would you consider organizing such a caucus to try to really put some pressure on the more corporate factions of the Democratic leadership?
Yeah, I definitely would. And I think we need it because, if you look at the caucuses that are in the House right now, so there's the New Democrats, which Derek Kilmer, my opponent, is the chair of. And that's the third wave, Clintonian, conservative wing of the party. It's the largest Democratic caucus in the House. They have so much power. They really, Derek Kilmer and the New Democrats, they kind of fly under the radar, but they're responsible for raising tens and tens of millions of dollars, supporting the centrists, opposing the progressives, squashing progressive policy. So we have them. Then we have the Problem Solvers Caucus, which Derek Kilmer is a part of. And that's, they bill themselves as quote unquote bipartisan, but they're half Democrat, half Republican, but they're funded by Republican billionaires. It's a very conservative caucus. And then we have the Progressive Caucus, which is very large, but it has people in the New Democrats who are also in the Progressive Caucus. So how can they really be, how can you have people in the Progressive Caucus who don't believe in Medicare for All? So I think we do need another caucus, and I would work on organizing it. And what exactly the criteria would be, I don't know, but at least one of them would be not taking any corporate money, no corporate PAC money, no lobbyist money. And if there's even, 5 to 10 people in that caucus, and we're all committed to working together, strategizing, being willing to take hard votes and withstand pressure from leadership, we could have a lot of power and build power for the progressive movement that way.
You've made environmental justice a central part of your campaign. Embracing the Green New Deal, as you've mentioned, and the aggressive need for sweeping environmental policy to be enacted immediately. And as you mentioned before, AOC came into office as an aggressive firebrand on that message. She protested with the Sunrise Movement outside of Nancy Pelosi's office. However, I think it should be mentioned that as AOC's tenure in Washington has grown, she has sided with the more establishment Democrats more and more. She recently came out as pro-nuclear and expanding the nuclear energy and allowing that to be entered into the Green New Deal. What is your stance on nuclear power? And if elected, how would you resist the pressures to pacify your demands within the Democratic Party?
Well, in terms of withstanding the pressures and from leadership in the Democratic Party, you have to be accountable to organizations outside of Congress. And so one organization that I'm accountable to is the DSA and to my local DSA chapters. And for example, there's an agreement with my Tacoma DSA, which I'm part of and I'm very active with, is that if they endorse a candidate agrees to meet with them on at least a quarterly basis. And there's, it's not like you just come in as a candidate and use the resources, get into office, and then thanks, bye, and you never hear from me again. There has to be some accountability and communication. And then also, I think that the left needs to build up more power to hold people accountable. Like, for example, and some kind of, whether it's DSA as it already exists, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but saying if you, get in and then betray us, we will replace you. We'll kick you out and we'll replace you. And that's what the Labour Party in the UK did. One of their co-founders became prime minister, and then he adopted an austerity agenda and betrayed them. And they kicked him out of the Labour Party while he was in office as prime minister. So that's the kind of thing that I think people on the left need to be willing to do with their leaders who betray them. However you define betraying, but there needs to be that kind of accountability. On nuclear, there's one there's one way to, I can't remember what it's called, but Bill Gates, his foundation did research into it. Apparently there's a new method to use nuclear waste in a way to create energy, and it spends the waste so that the waste is then gone, and it does not have to be then dumped in almost always poor communities like in Nevada or other places across the country where they can't fight back, they don't have the money to say no, and this waste gets dumped in their yard. This waste can be taken, used in a very safe way, much lower chance of meltdowns, and then the waste itself is used up and no longer exists. I think that's one thing to look at, not generating new nuclear energy, but in a safe way, using what exists, just getting it out of the system. Because, I remember this was a concern, like, almost 20 years ago when I was in 10th grade biology class, and one of their projects they had us do, like the teacher had us do, was like design. She was like, the teacher said, okay, so imagine we put all this nuclear waste in a mountain in Nevada, and it lasts for millions and millions of years. So imagine there's a future civilization that comes and they don't speak any human language. They don't recognize any of our symbols or music or anything. How are you going to design something that communicates to them that this is dangerous? That's how long nuclear waste lasts. It's very concerning. So I think it's a good question to bring up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks so much. We definitely need that kind of energy in the Democratic Party, and that willingness to buck orthodoxy and kind of fight back against the parties. And we're really hoping that you can succeed in your primary coming up in August.
Yeah, something that we thought was really powerful in one of your campaign videos was about how corporations constantly pillage natural resources from the communities that can't fight back. And you see that in Latino communities in Nevada, like you mentioned. You see it in white communities in Appalachia and West Virginia. You see it all over the country, and it's affecting all of the working people. Can you speak of some of the environmental pillaging that's currently going on in Washington?
Yeah, definitely. One is in my district, the timber industry. So the Olympic Peninsula, which for anyone not from this area, if you just picture the northwestern tip of the state, that's the Olympic Peninsula. And that's in my district. And it's absolutely beautiful. It has the Olympic National Forest and park in it. Like just miles and miles of coastline. It's just amazing. It's right up next to Canada. Very beautiful. And there are ancient, old growth ancient forests on the Olympic Peninsula that have been there forever. And timber companies like Weyerhaeuser came in, extracted all the timber they were legally allowed to, shipped it off. I mean, after the post-war boom, after World War II, the boards that built the houses across the country came from the Olympic Peninsula. So these companies came in, they extracted all these resources, extracted their profit, and then they just up and left. And they just left a gaping hole where all these jobs used to be. And a friend of mine who's from the area, and she's running for state legislature, Mariana Hopkins Everson, she describes it as, if a community could have PTSD, this is what it would look like. You know, a lot of the problems that we're recognizing now, like homelessness and the addiction, have been problems in that area, on the Olympic Peninsula for decades, and it's now like the rest of the country is sadly catching up. But this has been, in these places, it's been a problem for decades. And I mean, getting back to our earlier discussion about hunting, Weyerhaeuser, they had to, you know, replant all the forests, but it takes a long time before those trees are can then be logged, and so they're not doing anything with the land. They pay extremely low tax rates on acres and acres of land, and people in that area used to go onto Weyerhaeuser land to hunt and eat what they hunted, and then Weyerhaeuser put up fences to stop them from going on the land to hunt. And it's like Robin Hood days, and there's a royal forest, and the poachers aren't allowed onto the hunting grounds. I mean, it is like it's medieval. Like they just treat people like serfs, come in and use what they want, use the resources, use the labor, and then just up and disappear. And then like, if you try to just get food for your family, we'll screw you. Yeah, that's one way that we're seeing this kind of environmental devastation here. And another one is the orca population of orca whales. The orca population in the Puget Sound and on the US side of the border is in danger of going extinct, but on the northern side of the border in Canada, they are doing fine, they're thriving. And a lot of it is, in this area, we have dams that have been built, and it prevents salmon from going down the river. The whales eat the orcas eat the salmon, so that some of those dams need to be breached. Ocean acidification as part of climate change is very damaging to the orca whales. So there's stuff like that as well, where it affects the orca population, but then also the tribes on the coast, they have a tradition going back thousands of years of hunting whales. So if the whale population is going extinct, they have to get like special permission to hunt like one whale a year or something like that, whereas it used to be a very large part of their culture. So it's very negatively impactful.
Well, Rebecca, we certainly really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today, and we also certainly appreciate all the work that you're doing in your community. Can you tell people how they can support you?
Yeah, you can go to rebeccaforwa.com, and if you can afford to donate, I don't take any corporate PAC or lobbyist money, so you might think, oh, I can only give $1. I don't know, you know, that dollar helps. It funds calls for our phone bankers. And then you can also help out by volunteering. We have phone banks every day of the week, sometimes more than once a day, and you can do it from anywhere, from home safely. So you can sign up to volunteer at the events page on my website, and follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at rebeccaforwa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
For more content, check out our website at thevanguard.blog.
Or follow us on Twitter at the link below.